In the dusty sun-baked interrogation rooms of North Africa in 19... A peculiar scene played out with remarkable frequency, one that puzzled British intelligence officers until the pattern became undeniable. German prisoners of war, captured during the swirling chaos of the desert campaigns, would sit across the wooden tables, dirt-streaked and exhausted, and eventually interrupt their interrogators with a pressing question of their own. They did not ask about food, or the fate of the Third Reich, or the location of their comrades. Instead, they asked about the secret weapon. They demanded to know the location of the automatic 25. These veteran German soldiers, men who had conquered France and swept across the sands of Libya, had witnessed something on the battlefield that defied their understanding of mechanical possibility. They had seen artillery fire falling with such concentrated intensity, 8 rounds per minute or more, arriving in perfect cadence, that they refused to believe human crews were responsible. To the German mind, conditioned by the slower rhythms of their own logistics and equipment, the British must have developed a mechanized a secret piece of technology that allowed a single gun to rain destruction like a machine gun. The British officers would shake their heads, explaining that every shell was rammed by hand, every breach closed by muscle, and every firing solution calculated by a sergeant, but the prisoners rarely believed them. This persistent myth of the automatic cannon was the ultimate complement to the Royal Artillery, born not from a technological secret, but from a synergy of superior engineering, ruthless training, and a tactical doctrine that was years ahead of its time. The weapon at the center of this storm was the Ordnance QF 25-pounder, a gun that became the singular symbol of British dominance in the Mediterranean theater. While the German Wehrmacht is often remembered for its tanks and the terrifying 88mm flak gun, it was the British field artillery that the German infantrymen learned to fear above all else. It was a weapon system capable of dropping 72 shells on a specific target within 5 minutes of a forward observer spotting movement, a feat of coordination that the Axis forces simply could not replicate. The 25-pounder was the backbone of an artillery arm that broke the spirit of the Afrika Korps, eventually earning the begrudging respect of German high command, who admitted after the war that the Royal Artillery was the most professional and formidable branch of the British Army they had ever encountered. To understand why this gun created such a psychological impact, one must look at the genesis of its design, which was driven by a requirement in the 1930s to replace 2 different aging weapons, the 18-pounder field gun and the 4.5-inch howitzer. The British Army sought a gun howitzer, a hybrid weapon that could fire at high velocity for long-range interdiction and anti-tank work, but also at high angles to drop shells behind cover in the undulating terrain of a modern battlefield. The result of the design work at Woolwich Arsenal was a masterpiece of compromise and utility. With a caliber of 87.6mm, it fired a shell weighing 25 pounds, a weight chosen because it offered the perfect balance between lethality and logistics. Smaller shells lacked the explosive mass to shatter dug-in infantry, while larger shells were too heavy for a crew to handle rapidly, which would have slowed the rate of fire. The 25-pounder hit the Goldilocks zone, light enough to be manhandled by a frantic crew but heavy enough to destroy seconded vehicles and shatter morale. The engineering brilliance of the 25-pounder was most visible in its carriage design. Specifically, the inclusion of a circular firing platform carried beneath the gun. In the fluid, 360-degree warfare of the North African desert, where threats could appear from any compass point, this feature proved revolutionary. When the gun was brought into action, the platform was lowered to the ground, and the gun's wheels were pulled up onto it. This allowed the crew to rotate the entire weapon 360 degrees in seconds simply by pushing the tail of the carriage. By contrast, German and American artillery pieces, like the standard Leffe 18 or the M2A1, 105mm had limited traverse on their carriages. If a target appeared outside that narrow arc, the entire German gun crew had to physically lift and drag the heavy trails of their weapon to reposition it, a process that cost precious minutes in combat. The British crew could simply spin their gun on its platform and engage a flanking tank attack immediately. This agility allowed the 25-pounder to function not just as indirect artillery, but as a formidable direct-fire weapon when British positions were overrun, saving countless lives during the confused withdrawals of 1941 and 1942. However, the hardware was only half of the equation. The automatic nature of the gun that so baffled the Germans was the result of the crew. A 25-pounder detachment consisted of 6 men, and their operation was a choreographed dance of lethal efficiency. The number 1, usually a sergeant, commanded the gun. The number 2 operated the breech and rammed the shell. The number 3 was the layer, keeping the sights locked on the aiming stakes or the target. The numbers 4, 5, and 6 handled the ammunition preparation and fusing. Through relentless drilling, these men achieved a synchronization that blurred the lines between man and machine. A well-trained detachment could fire a round, open the breech, eject the spent casing, load a new shell and cartridge, close the breech, and fire again in under 6 seconds. The layer could keep his eye on the sight throughout the recoil, meaning the gun did not have to be re-aimed between shots. Exceptional crews, like those of the 4th Royal Field Artillery Regiment, were recorded firing 17 rounds in a single minute during emergencies. To a German observer on the receiving end, huddled in a slit trench while shells exploded every few seconds, the idea that this was being done by sweating men loading ammunition seemed impossible. The ammunition system itself contributed to this versatility. Unlike fixed ammunition, where the shell and cartridge case are one unit, the 25-pounder used separate loading ammunition. The shell was loaded first, followed by the cartridge case containing the This allowed the crew to vary the charge bags inside the case to adjust the range. The charges were color-coded in silk bags. Charge 1 red for short range, Charge 2 red and white for medium, and Charge 3 red, white, and blue for long range. There is also a supercharge for maximum range, pushing the shell out to over 12,000 meters. This system gave the gunner immense control over the trajectory. He could fire a shell at a high angle to drop it steeply behind a ridge using a small charge, or fire it at a flat trajectory using a supercharge to reach deep into the enemy rear. This flexibility meant that a single battery of 25-pounders could perform missions that required 2 or 3 different types of German guns. The disparity in artillery capability was not just about the guns, but about the systems that controlled them. This is where the British Army held a decisive, often overlooked advantage known as the staccato of war. The Royal Artillery had developed a centralized, hierarchical fire control network that allowed for the rapid massing of fire. A British forward observer foe was not merely an advisor, he had the authority to command the guns. If an FO spotted a target, he could call for a Mike target, which brought down the fire of his entire regiment 24 guns. If the target was larger, he could call an uncle target, summoning the fire of the entire division's artillery 72 guns. In extreme cases, a victor target could be called, bringing every gun within range from the entire corps or army onto a single grid square. Because of the standardized training and excellent radio networks, the response time for these missions was terrifyingly short. A British battery could have rounds in the air 90 seconds after the call was made. In stark contrast, the German artillery doctrine was decentralized. German batteries were often attached to infantry battalions, giving local commanders direct support but making it extremely difficult to mass fire from multiple regiments onto a single point. If a German observer wanted to bring down the fire of 50 guns, the request had to be routed through multiple headquarters, approved, coordinated, and calculated, a process that could take 15 to 20 minutes. By the time the German shells arrived, the British targets had often moved. This speed differential, 90 seconds versus 15 minutes, was the defining factor in the artillery war. It meant that British artillery could disrupt German attacks while they were still forming up, whereas German artillery was often reacting to events that had already happened. German intelligence reports from 1943 expressed bewilderment at this capability, noting that British fire coordination was inexplicably rapid and assuming, again, that some technological solution was involved, rather than superior doctrine. The impact of this superiority was felt throughout the North African campaign, but never more so than during the defensive battles of 1942. At the First Battle of El Alamein, in July, the automatic guns saved the British line. South African artillery units, specifically the Cape Field Artillery, played a heroic role. During one desperate day, 3 South African batteries fired over 9,000 shells to break up German armor attacks. The heat was so intense that the oil in the recoil buffers boiled, and the gun crews stripped to the waist, their skin blistered by the sun and the radiant heat of the barrels. Yet, they maintained the rate of fire. German tank crews, who were used to crushing infantry defenses, found themselves driving into a wall of high explosives that stripped away their infantry support and damaged their optics and tracks. Captured German documents from this period noted that South African and British artillery was the single greatest impediment to their advance, with one officer writing that they could not move in the open without being instantly targeted by accurate, heavy fire. The climax of the 25-pounders' desert service came with the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, a battle that began with the largest artillery bombardment in history up to that point. General Bernard Montgomery assembled nearly 900 field guns, the vast majority of them 25-pounders, along a 40-mile front. The logistical buildup was staggering. Millions of rounds were stockpiled. On the night of October 23rd, at 21:40 hours, the order was given, and 882 guns opened fire simultaneously. The noise was heard in Alexandria, 60 miles away. For the German soldiers on the receiving end, it was the apocalypse. The rate of fire was sustained at 5 rounds per gun per minute for 20 minutes, a stunk of unimaginable proportions. In that opening barrage alone, 500,000 shells were expended. The German defenses were not just suppressed, they were erased. Communication wires were cut, trenches collapsed, and minefields were churned into dust. While the British guns were feasting on a limitless supply of ammunition, the German artillery was starving. Rommel's supply lines, stretching all the way back to Tripoli and constantly harried by the Royal Navy and RAF, had collapsed. By the time of the battle, many German batteries were down to their last dozen rounds per gun. The mathematics of the battle became simple and fatal. the British could fire continuously for days, while the Germans could barely fire for hours. General Gustav von Verst of the Afrika Korps reported that his artillery was effectively silenced not by enemy action, but by a lack of shells. When the British offensive, Operation Supercharge, began in November, the New Zealand division attacked behind a creeping barrage so dense that it placed one shell every 19 meters. No army could withstand such a concentration. German prisoners taken during this phase were often found in a state of catatonic shock, bleeding from the ears due to the overpressure of thousands of simultaneous explosions. Asking once again where the automatic cannon were hidden, the lethality of the 25-pounder was also a result of the types of ammunition it could fire. While the high-explosive He shell was the workhorse, the solid armor-piercing AP shot allowed the gun to act as a formidable anti-tank weapon, though not designed primarily for this role. The 20-pound solid steel shot could penetrate the armor of Panzer III and IV tanks at combat ranges. During the chaotic retreats of 1941 and the desperate stands at Tobruk, 25-pounder crews often engaged German tanks over open sights. The tragedy of these engagements was that the gun shield provided almost no protection for the crew. To fire at a tank, the crew had to stand exposed. Many gunners died firing their weapons until the very last second, trading their lives to stop an armored breakthrough. At Tobruk, the 9th Australian Divisional Artillery became legendary for this, repulsing tank attacks with direct fire and earning a reputation for aggression that terrified the Italian and German infantry. Tasked with storming the fortress, comparing the 25-pounder to its contemporaries highlights its unique position in the arsenal of democracy. The American M2A1 105mm howitzer, which began arriving in North Africa with the torch landings in late 1942, was an excellent weapon with a heavier shell 33 pounds compared to 25. The American shell threw more shrapnel and had a better digging effect against fortifications. However, the British argument was that the lighter 25-pounder allowed for a higher rate of fire, meaning more shells in the air per minute, which suppressed the enemy more effectively. In artillery theory, suppression is often more important than destruction. If the enemy has their heads down because shells are landing every 2 seconds, they cannot shoot back, regardless of how heavy the individual shells are. Furthermore, the British gun was lighter and more mobile. It could be towed by a standard Morris C8 quad tractor or a Canadian military pattern truck at 30 miles per hour, and its shoot and scoot tactics were superior. British batteries would fire a mission, hook up and move 800 yards to a new position before the German counter-battery fire could locate them. The heavier American and German guns were often too slow to execute this maneuver effectively. The tactical mobility of the British artillery was supported by a level of motorization that the Germans could only dream of. While propaganda reels showed German panzer divisions streaming forward, the reality was that the vast majority of the Wehrmacht's artillery was horse-drawn. In the desert, horses were a liability, requiring immense amounts of water and fodder. The fully motorized Royal Artillery did not have this tether. They could move guns across the desert floor as fast as the tanks they supported. This strategic mobility meant that British commanders could shift artillery weight from one flank to another overnight, achieving local superiority at critical points. Rommel, a master of maneuver, found himself constantly checkmated by this flexibility. He could outmaneuver the British tanks, but he could rarely escape the reach of the British guns. The legacy of the 20-pounder extends far beyond the sands of North Africa. It proved that a single well-designed system could replace multiple specialist weapons, simplifying the logistical nightmare of modern war. Its performance in the desert cemented the reputation of the Royal Artillery as the ubique everywhere force. Post-war analysis by military historians and former German officers alike consistently rated the British artillery system as the finest of the war. General Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote extensively about the paralyzing effect of British shelling. He noted that while American material superiority was overwhelming later in the war, it was the British technical skill and gunnery that left the deepest impression on the German professional officer corps. They had encountered an enemy who could do the math of war faster than they could. The gun remained in service. For decades after the fall of the Third Reich, it fought in the jungles of Malaya, the hills of Korea, and conflicts across the Middle East and Africa. Its longevity was a testament to the soundness of its basic design. Even as self-propelled guns and rockets came to dominate the battlefield, the simple, rugged, and rapid-firing 25-pounder held its place. It was the soldier's gun, reliable, accurate, and capable of a rate of fire that felt supernatural to those on the wrong end of the barrel. Ultimately, the story of the automatic 25-pounder is a story about the human element in warfare. The German prisoners who sat in those interrogation rooms in 1942 were not stupid men. They were experienced combat veterans who knew the sounds of war. That they could be so thoroughly deceived by the performance of the Royal Artillery is the greatest validation of the British gun crews. It was not a machine that fired 17 rounds a minute. It was 6 men, working in the heat and the dust, fueled by adrenaline and drill. loading and firing with such precision that they transcended the mechanical limits of their weapon. They turned a bolt-action piece of ordnance into a wall of fire, and in doing so, they broke the back of the Axis in Africa. The 25-pounder was not a wonder weapon in the technological sense, but in the hands of the Royal Artillery, it performed like one, leaving a legacy of dominance that echoed long after the last shell casing hit the desert sand.